the chat program has been looking at the 1950s this year, and we've looked at a lot of nostalgia and fashion and music and so on. But there's a flip side to this, and that's also that the 1950s were an era in which America found itself challenged, and the reaction is one of not nostalgia, but one of fear. And the popular culture of the time, whether it was music or TV programs, and especially Hollywood, which is the most important mass media at the time, although television was coming on very fast, what reflected those fears in a lot of the films. Now, this doesn't mean that the filmmakers are necessarily, they had planned to do this. Like most filmmakers, they make movies for a variety of interests, including making a lot of money and exploiting interests and exploiting situations. Hence all the Westerns in the 1950s, and as we see, we had all of the Vietnam vet movies in the 1970s and 80s, because they were playing up on a trend. But in this case, there were very real fears. They impacted our country in a major way. And I want to challenge you to think about these as we go through this, as how different we are from all of this today. It's easy to look back on the 50s and say that, well, those are people from another time and another place. They're not like us. And I would suggest we really haven't changed all that much. So, that being in mind, let's move through this. I have a lot of slides here. The 1950s, and especially the Cold War, as Dr. Keel pointed out, presented a lot of challenges to Americans. The fear of communism, the fear of change, the fear of destruction. We'll go through all of these here. And they were especially disturbing because the United States had been at the pinnacle of power in 1945. We thought we remade the world in our image. The dollar was now the world currency. The United Nations was the capital of the world in New York, and everything looked like it was going to be the American way or the American century. But almost immediately, that world fell apart. We talked about this last year when I did the introduction to the Cold War series. And the reaction to this was shock and fear. And with the Cold War against the Russians now replacing the war against Nazism, and the shocks of well, we had the atomic bomb, but very quickly the Russians had one as well. And it was no longer going to be our way anymore. We would have to learn to live with somebody who seemed diametrically opposed to us. And rather than trying to understand the Russians, our reaction was in fact one of fear and confrontation. The fear of communism was probably the largest fear in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and all the way through the 80s. Our idea of communism came from popular culture, and there seems to be lots and lots of ones where women are the victims, and that clearly that's hitting Americans at an emotional level, that part of the reason why we're fighting is to protect American womanhood from the evils of communism or saucer men or giant monsters. And oftentimes, by the way, in the films, the scenes where they're holding women, usually scantily clad, doesn't ever occur, but they are very good at selling movies. So, in this case, you see in the center, of course, that if communists ever take over, they're going to take over all of Americans. They're going to beat up on black people and take over women and so on. Our fear of communism was not only a fear of a communist threat from the outside, but that somehow we would be infused with the disease of communism and it would overthrow our country. And as I tried to point out last year, there just was no chance of that happening. Here we were, the richest country in the world, and we were going to give that up for everybody having a piece of the pie. We still haven't done anything like that. And there's no chance of it ever happening. The United States simply has too much at stake. Americans have too much at stake to ever want to overthrow their country so that they can steal from somebody and give to themselves. Communism was often described, and you'll see this with a lot of the movies, as a monster. And it was easy for Americans to understand that. And this, of course, is Joseph Stalin, who was the dictator of the Soviet Union at the time, on the face of a giant octopus. And it's ironic that one of the first big monster movies was It Came from Beneath the Sea, where the octopus attacks that bastion of liberalism, San Francisco. Clearly, these kinds of pictures were meant to inculcate the idea that if we allowed communism to take place, that our values, our ideas, our religious beliefs, our whole very way of life was under threat. And you see this, I mean, look at this, this communist. He's dark-skinned and disheveled. He's carrying a bomb. That means he's an anarchist. He wants to destroy government. and he's carrying a notched, bloody knife that says Bolshevism, which is communism, just in case you didn't get it. So the images, again, clearly the image of America as we like to see ourselves. Of course, we didn't do anything bad. We were always the shining light in the world. And of course, in the 50s, we were supporting dictatorships that were suppressing people left and right, but that's okay. We stood for liberty. One of the results, of course, of this fear of communism was McCarthyism at home. For those of you who don't know, Senator McCarthy made a political career out of accusing people of being communists. And we call it a witch hunt because literally to be accused meant you were a communist. And if you said you weren't, we said, well, we know communists lie. So just like witches, if you're accused of a witch during the period of the Renaissance and you said you weren't, then you were lying. And if you were, then the only way to test you is to throw you in the pond. And if you floated, you were a witch. And if you sank and drowned, you weren't. So to be accused during that time meant literally that you were guilty as charged. And you see here, I love this cartoon where they're driving over all these people and say, it's okay, we're hunting communists. And the blacklisting of the Hollywood 10 and so on. Another thing, of course, was that Americans in the 1950s, we like to think about the civil rights movement. Everybody remembers Martin Luther King and all of the triumph of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but we often forget that it started in the 1950s and that the reaction of not just Southerners, but whites throughout America, including the president, was this was a waste of time, that we shouldn't be doing this. And this is from Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And you can see real Americans as they considered themselves. And black Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, they weren't real Americans. They were somebody else. And for these people to be standing up and asking for rights, this was a shock to the system of an America that always perceived itself along racial lines as being white. And of course, there's a series of books like this. This was a very popular book put out by a number of religious groups telling you how to be afraid. One of the other things, and I wanted to tie this in with something that Professor Regier talked about, women's issues, of course, was that women, as they were finding their place in the 1950s, many of them were challenging traditional ideas and values, but at the same time, society was trying to put them into a box to a certain extent. So you see here, we have the first real look at female sexuality coming out in the 1950s with the Second Sex and the Kinsey Report, and the first women ministers in some of the churches, the Presbyterian Church in 1955, and of course Rosa Parks standing up for civil rights. But at the same time, we're having Mamie Eisenhower, the president's wife, being thanked by the Ladies' Home Journal because she was not trying to be an intellectual. That's not what women are supposed to do. So all those of you trying to get a degree, just remember that. And she was not a blue stocking, meaning that she was like a rarefied or a kind of a snooty feminist. They're referring, of course, to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was really from the previous generation, who was, in fact, both an intellectual and a feminist. And they thought Mamie Eisenhower was the more traditional American president's wife, first lady. They just said many of the same things about Barbara Bush, not Barbara Bush, but Laura Bush. She was not like Hillary Clinton when she came in office a few years ago. Of course, on the other hand, and we were objectifying women in a big way in the 1950s. The quintessential perfect woman were these blonde bombshells with incredibly busty bodies and incredibly platinum blonde hair. Remember also that 1954 was the very first issue of Playboy magazine. And so these kinds of things were the so-called perfect woman was being put out there in the public media because people were finding, in fact, that the new woman was something that was a little shocking. And then, of course, this quote that I just found today at the very bottom, which I thought was very interesting. If a woman works towards her career or she has a career ambition, it's clearly the reason why all women might become mentally ill and their husbands would be upset and their kids would, in fact, become homosexuals. It's all the woman's fault. So women were challenging many male assumptions at this time. It wasn't the full-blown feminist movement of the 60s, but the roots were being laid in a big way in the 1950s. Now, of course, how do you talk about all of the things that we're leading to today and without considering the bomb? If you've ever, and I don't mean the bomb as it's used today, but the bomb literally meaning that the end of the world. the atomic bomb. But by the middle of the 1950s, we're talking about the hydrogen bomb, which uses atomic bombs simply as a trigger device. An atomic bomb would, in 1945, destroyed something, a 2-mile square area, and irradiated people for enough so that they could get leukemia and die in a few years. The hydrogen bomb would kill everybody within a 10-mile, or in many cases, a 20 megaton. A bomb would literally kill everybody in a 20 square mile radius and have long-lasting effects that would spread around the globe. This pursuit of atomic weapons became a national obsession, starting from once the Russians began the explosion of their first atomic bomb in 1949. And it's not a coincidence that the race for the hydrogen bomb goes on at the same time while these first monster movies about the effects of the bomb arise in the early 1950s, 51, 52, 53. So, by the way, if you wear a hat, you can prevent yourself from the heat flash, as this guy is showing here. And of course, the idea is here's Manhattan getting its just desserts, I guess. Okay. Now, let's take a look at some of the films of the era. This is not a film, but again, these are certain themes, and a lot of these films actually reflect more than just one theme. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to edit all of that, and I will. So, first of all, one of the key themes in the monster and movies and atomic bomb movies of the era is that this is going to be the end of mankind. And this is, of course, where they often don't show an atomic bomb. They use a monster to represent the destruction of the earth or some of these other themes that we have here. So we have the day the world ended. Very devilish-looking character there, and of course a scantily clad woman who he's really after all the time anyway. From hell it came, the beast thing from out of the earth. The day that the earth stood still, which is actually an interesting movie because it's it's about the irresponsibility of having atomic weapons and threatening everybody, but the way it was portrayed to the public is this horrible monster and the destruction of the earth. And you'll see a few more pictures from that later on. Again, there's a scantily clad woman. Again, see this crawling hand and this giant robot. And the robots were often a metaphor for communists because they didn't think, they were brainwashed. They only do what they're told, and if you become a communist, that's what's awaiting you. So robots were very big. Another thing that if you look at the films of this era is the idea that humanity is somehow helpless and it's beyond our control. It's out of nature has changed in dramatic ways. And again, the incredible shrinking man starts shrinking when he's exposed to atomic energy. So here he is being chased by that horrible monster you have at home, a cat. So, but he's got his weapon there, as you can see. Somehow his clothes shrunk with him, which is pretty interesting. This island Earth, while it's about travel to other planets, also again is the theme about that humanity is helpless in the in the fate of dealing with all of these kinds of issues. Another theme, of course, for any science instructors here is that the science has run amok somehow and it's out of control. Evil, mad scientists are out there and they're not using any moral compass to keep them in line. And so you'll see a series of films here. One of the probably the two most important films that we'll take note of today, one of them is The Thing, which really reflects this era in so many different ways. The Thing is a creature from another planet, and in the original book, which was called Who Goes There, it was about a creature that could be anybody. It could be, it would take over your body and it would become you, and nobody else would know who it was. I mean, it's like a communist. Are they secretly a communist? No, it's secretly a vegetable creature from another planet that's occupying you, what looks like you, but we don't know if it is or isn't. Now, they didn't do that in the original film here. They simply focused in on a radioactive creature from another planet who comes to the Earth and tries to take over. It was remade in 1983 I think it was John Carpenter's The Thing, and it was, they went more back to the idea that it could be anybody. It was the spread of not knowing who was behind the creature, whether the person sitting next to you is a creature or not. This is a classic film because it's really about the communist threat, and in a very obvious way. Fiend without a face, again, a mad scientist loose. In this case, look at that strange creature he's created. Scantily clad women. The magnetic monster again. Science, something that nobody could possibly expect. And then there's Robbie the robot. I don't know if you've seen old episodes of Lost in Space where he survived into the 1960s, and they even used the same robot basically in the remake of Lost in Space in the 80s. But here he is, you know, grasping a woman, of course. I think that's a woman. And with all the science trying to stop him, the science monster, the flame bearer. What happens when we send our first satellite out? Now, another one, of course, and this is a major theme of the 1950s, is that we are under threat of invasion from the outside. And a lot of the stuff that you'll see, I mean, with the use of women being threatened and with these outsiders, these strange people, invasion is a common theme, and there's a lot of these in the 1950s. Battle in outer space, the war, the space race, while it fascinated people, also threatened the imminent destruction of the planet again. It conquered the world. 20 million miles to Earth, and so on. This is a great Harryhausen film of stop-action motion like King Kong. Killers from space, the Earth attacked. This, again, is another one of the worst movies of all time, Plan 9 from Outer Space. They don't tell you about Plans 1 through 8, but they're pretty bad, too. They've got vampires and everything in here. This is actually a pretty good movie, Earth versus the Flying Saucers. A number of the movies, including Mars Attacks, were basically based on this one. Angry Red Planet. Again, those angry reds. They even tinted the film to make it look red. The Blob is a classic. Steve McQueen getting his first start in this film. Again, radiation gets this out of this monster from somewhere else attacking us and invading us, and there's no way to stop it. And again, the animation is incredibly cheesy. Attack of the Crab Monsters, and of course he's found the only unclad woman in the whole place, but this is a pretty bad movie, nowhere near as good as that. Them is a total classic. Again, giant ants that come out of the deserts of New Mexico where the atomic testing took place, and the radiation, and they of course swarm into the tunnels of the sewers of Los Angeles, and then the army goes and gets them. And this is another theme in a lot of these films, and that is the military will save us from these monsters. And whereas the military were never heroes in the movies, the monster movies of the 30s and 40s, it was always scientists or good men and women who stood up to vampires and werewolves and other kinds of monsters. In the 1950s, it's the military who's out there defending us from these horrible creatures. The Beginning of the End. The Beginning of the End is a film I've been trying to download. For some reason I haven't been able to get it. What you see here are giant grasshoppers that attack Chicago. And the special effects were that they put postcards of Chicago buildings and had grasshoppers crawl all over them. It's pretty sad. But we had Peter Graves, who later went on to fame and fortune and stuff in one of his films. And we also have in some of these films, we also start seeing women scientists for the first time. Although they always scream and grab some man when they need help. It Came from Beneath the Sea, 1951, really started a lot of the trends on this. Again, San Francisco, there goes the ferry building as it comes up Market Street. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and this was probably the first, this was 1953, Harryhausen. This monster is radioactive, so as they kill it or they start to attack it and its blood drips out, people are being exposed to radiation and they're getting sick and falling down on the ground and so on. It's a wonderful film. It is very influential in terms of theme. And the stop-action motion is very good. It was in the Arctic, an atomic test in the Arctic. I didn't know we ever tested in the Arctic, but an atomic test breaks the ice and lets it out, and it heads to New York. Of course, all monsters always head to big cities. They never come to Porterville. But it goes to New York and goes on a rampage. And it becomes the basis for many of the other films that we're going to see during this decade. Now, Gojira. We all know this as Godzilla, which of course is a total mispronunciation of the Japanese Gojira. And Gojira, for those of you studying Asian history, is not just another monster movie. It's in fact, and we, in the United States, and I have the American movie poster here, which is Godzilla the Fire Monster. And not only do we get the name wrong, but we get the whole idea of what this thing is all about. It's a fire monster and it breathes fire. And in the 20 or so movies that have been made since then, they emphasize that. But in the original movie, Gojira has an atomic breath. And he really refers to, there's several different levels of things going on here, as in many things that are Japanese. One is, he represents the American atomic destruction of Japan, a kind of mindless destruction as he marches around stomping Tokyo and exuding his atomic breath. That's a pretty clear connection there to the atomic bombing of Japan. He also, in a way, stands for a punishment of Japan for not being true to itself, and that those kinds of scenes in this movie were cut out when it came to the United States. They didn't want to emphasize that. They didn't think the American public would understand it. So Gojira was made in '54, good year by the way, and Gojira raids again. Gojira no Gyakushu was also in '55. And the first of, again, these other monsters. So you can learn some basic Japanese kanji here at the top. Gojira is the first ones at the top. Of course, in the United States, it was released as Godzilla, King of the Fire Monster, or King of Monsters, and they even cut in some scenes of an American reporter so that you could understand all the things going on. But it's really kind of an interesting tale originally about what should science do? What kind of decisions should science? There's a scientist who invents something called an oxygen destroyer, and he basically kills himself at the end to prevent it from getting into the hands of governments. And that's a very Japanese thing, which we cut out of our American version of the film because we didn't understand that. Why would they kill themselves to prevent science from progressing? So watch that movie and understand it's not just another monster movie. It's really an understanding of Japan looking at itself after the dropping of the atomic bombs. It spawned a British copy called The Giant Behemoth. And then, of course, we went off on a number of other ones that are like this. The Black Scorpion attacks Mexico City. And so every city gets a chance here. Again, I don't think I've ever met any scorpions that have two eyes, but that's okay. This is probably amongst the worst movies ever made. And the picture of this is better than the special effects in this, which are incredibly bad. The Giant Claw from 17 million BC. Leeches. Even worse special effects. Cosmic monsters, again, a spider with eyes. The giant mantis, again, they're running out of insects, I'm afraid. Here's again some very themes in here. The Bride of the Beast, showing a gorilla, again, with a scantily clad blonde woman. And there's a lot of symbols here that reflect a fear of African Americans and the long suggestion that the African Americans are only after white women. Which was supplanted by slave owners as a way to justify keeping African Americans in check while they were busily raping slave women. But that's one of those interesting things. I guess you can make up all kinds of stuff. But it's an image that is still with us. I mean, certainly exploited by King Kong in the 1930s. Here's this giant monster. And of course, he'll eat all the black women, but he won't eat the blonde. He's got to fall in love with her, which is kind of silly, but okay. Again, the attack of the puppet people. If you got a mad dog, that's what you need to do. The Fly. Who can forget the Fly movies and even the remakes? These are pretty horrible movies. Again, about science out of control and also about nature out of control. We also should fear people who are not like us. And I think this is something that is still around. And in this case, I was a communist for the FBI, and I turned in my own girl. That shows you got to be serious about this. That was a popular radio program that became a movie then. This is probably the quintessential movie of the whole era, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Wonderful movie. It's been remade, I think, 4 times since then, 3 or 4 times. It's, again, all about radiation spreading from New Mexico, infects some pods, which go over some city called Santa Mira, California. It doesn't exist. And there the pods, you fall asleep, and then next morning a pod, something that looks just like you, wakes up, and they're soulless. They don't have a soul. You have no emotion. It's communism. You've become a communist, and you're under the control, and you're trying to change everybody else into you. And this movie was very, very influential, not only in pop culture, but the way we saw communism in the 1950s. Pod people. And so, again, a great film. If you don't have pod people, you have mole people coming up from underground. Alligator people. We're running out of animals, I guess. Here's another favorite. Teenage hoodlums on a horrendous ray gun rampage. So look out. The Beast of a Million Eyes. Though I only see 2 of them, really. Now, the one we were just watching before we first came in here, of course, they have it. It doesn't look this good, but not only where you grow to giant size if you're exposed to radiation, but in a way this is kind of a story about a Korean War vet who has all kinds of problems, and being exposed to radiation is one of them. But in the end, he gets killed over there by Hoover Dam. Robots were another popular theme, and we need to wrap this up pretty quick. Robots are, again, a word for communists. They're soulless. They don't think like us. They act on orders. And again, Robbie the Robot's making a comeback here. Forbidden Planet is a classic film which really has not a single scene that looks like this. So certainly the woman that the robot carries doesn't look like this, but Tobor the Great, again, robotic monsters. Now we get to dangerous women. With women challenging many of the issues. Of course, the 50-foot woman never got that big. She's more like 250 feet there. And the film is, again, incredibly cheesy. Astounding She Creature, the Wasp Woman. I think I have one of those in my backyard. She comes complete with makeup, you notice. Look at those eyelashes. It comes, by the way, she's trying to get wasp venom in her perfume company so that she can live longer. So you never know what you're getting with perfumes and facial creams. Catwomen on the Moon's pretty bad. What's worse than bad? Fire maidens. This is a woman grabbing a woman. That's kind of interesting. And our last movie, the She Creature. And I want to suggest, after looking at all these things, that of course that this climate of fear was not without consequences. There was political repression in the 1950s. There was a emphasis on conformity, being like everybody else. I mean, even Lucy and Ricky living in their house, sleep in separate beds. And I've always wondered, where did little Ricky come from if they did that? There were loyalty oaths. If you were a teacher or you want to be a teacher, you know you have to sign an oath not to teach communism to people, so we'll overthrow the government. That's still around since the 50s. Religious conformity and intolerance, the under God in the flag salute was put in the 1950s to prevent us from becoming godless communists. There was strong resistance throughout the United States to civil rights. The United States was militarized in the sense that the military-industrial complex became important enough that General Eisenhower began to warn us about that at the end of the 1950s. And the military has been on war throughout the entire 50s, is on a wartime strength, which it hadn't ever been before. If you were opposing any of this, you were disloyal, and obviously constitutional rights got thrown out the window. Are we any smarter than we were in the 1950s? These all come from events fairly recently from the internet. And you can see that there's a lot of sites, by the way, that are absolutely full of hate and fear. The whole campaign that we most recently had a lot of it was from the other side, I guess, from the Democrats, was based on fear. This communism poster is brand new, and it's out on the internet, I guess, which is fairly recent. There's the Klan site. Fear of terrorism should make us all give up all of our rights and so on. If you ever traveled by air recently, you know how bad that's become. And in the last election, we had Proposition 8, which certainly was predicated on the fear that if you allow gays to marry, somehow civilization is going to end. So, and there were good-meaning people on both sides in that, but the way it was portrayed by many people, the way it was brought out a lot of the worst. And of course, that little girl in the Klan outfit. You know, this area has always been strong with the Klan. The 1950s are often portrayed in a nostalgic way, with fun and surfers and all of this, and partying and 50s music and Elvis. But there's a flip side to this as well. And we need to take this seriously, and we need to learn from all of this and not let fear dominate our thinking and make us become irrational more than anything else. I think being here at school, you need to remember, learn to think for yourselves. Don't let somebody else or some media giant tell you what you to think. Get as many different opinions as possible and then make up your own mind. And if you do that, then you've learned from the 1950s.